The first arrow tore through the air with a sound like a viper's hiss. It found its mark not in wood or shield, but in the vulnerable gap between Margrave Luitpold's gorget and chin. The force of it snapped his head back. He did not cry out. The shock was too absolute, the invasion of his own body too profound. He dropped to his knees in the cold mud of the Danube riverbank. The world narrowed to a tunnel. At the end of that tunnel was his son, Berthold. The boy, for he was scarcely more than that, lay on his side, one arm outstretched. A second arrow had entered just below his eye. He was already gone. Around them, in a ragged, shrinking circle, lay the flower of Bavarian nobility. 300 knights, men whose lineages stretched back to the companions of Charlemagne. Their magnificent mail, a fortune in iron rings, was now a death shroud, pierced in a dozen places. Their war horses, mountains of muscle and pride, were twitching heaps on the ground. The sacred relics, borne by Archbishop Theotmar to ensure divine favour, were trampled into the muck. Nothing had saved them. Not skill, not steel, not prayer. And beyond this ring of carnage, as far as the eye could see, the Hungarians moved. Not in a charging mass, but in a perpetual swirling dance of death. Thousands upon thousands of horse archers, riding in loose, interweaving bands. They circled. They fired. They waited. There was no urgency in their movements, only a dreadful patient efficiency. This was not a battle. It was the closing act of an execution. 3 weeks earlier, Margrave Luitpold had ridden out of Regensburg at the head of the largest military force assembled in Christendom in 100 years, 100,000 men. The chroniclers strain for words to describe it. A moving forest of spears, a river of steel, an avalanche of faith and fury. Bavarians, Swabians, Franconians, knights in glinting chainmail, some adorned with the new fashion of plate on chest and shoulders, a vast tide of infantry with tall, painted shields, regiments of archers and crossbowmen, trains of wagons carrying siege engines, catapults, and battering rams, a second army of priests, scribes, blacksmiths, cooks, and camp followers snaked along behind. Their mission was born of a decade of humiliation, to march into the heart of Hungary itself, to find the Magyar army and crush it in a single, glorious, decisive battle, to end, once and for all, the raids that had bled the German duchies white, that had turned their eastern marches into a landscape of ashes and ghosts. They were supremely confident. They were overwhelmingly powerful. They carried the blessings of the church. By the 20th of August, in the year 907, almost none of them were alive. Not captured for ransom. Not scattered in retreat. Dead. The Battle of Pressburg stands as one of the most total military catastrophes in European history. And yet, for centuries, it was a ghost. A whisper lost between the pages of history. An entire generation of German martial and aristocratic leadership was erased in a single afternoon. Family lines that had weathered the fall of Rome vanished without a trace. The Carolingian Empire, the fading legacy of Charlemagne, received its final mortal blow. And the Hungarians, the Magyars, did not merely survive this confrontation. Their victory secured their dominance over Central Europe for the next 50 years, a half-century they would spend raiding with impunity from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. But the critical truth, the one that transforms this from a tragedy into a cautionary tale, is this: Pressburg was not an accident. It was not bad luck, a sudden storm, or an act of God. The German army, in all its colossal, gleaming might, walked with open eyes into a trap that had been designed over years of observation, laid with meticulous patience, and which, once it sprung, allowed for no possibility of escape. The question we are here to answer is not simply what happened, but how. How does an army of 100,000 men, comprised of trained soldiers, led by experienced commanders, armed with the best technology of its age, get completely and utterly annihilated by an enemy they were so certain they could destroy? The answer lies not in a single moment of madness, but in a slow, fatal chain of assumptions, pressures, and misjudgments. It is a story of how pride can blind even the most powerful, and how a failure to understand your enemy is the first and greatest step toward defeat. If you are fascinated by these forgotten hinges of history, by the moments where the world turns and empires crumble into dust, please help this channel grow. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on this story. Your engagement genuinely helps these lost narratives reach a wider audience. And the story of Pressburg, a story that reshaped a continent, deserves to be remembered. Now, let me take you back to the world that created this disaster. To understand why 100,000 men marched to their deaths, you must first understand the shadow that drove them east. You must understand the Magyars. In the closing decades of the 9th century, as the Carolingian Empire fractured into squabbling kingdoms, a new and terrifying force erupted onto the plains of Central Europe. They came from the east, from the endless grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. They were not European. They did not fight like Europeans. They did not think like Europeans. And that, in the beginning, was the source of their terrifying power. Their culture was born in the saddle. A Magyar child learned to ride and shoot a bow almost before they could walk. Their entire society, their economy, their cosmology was built around the horse and the composite recurve bow. Pressed by other nomadic confederations, 7 Magyar tribes under the leadership of the shrewd and charismatic Prince Arpad migrated westward in the late 8th century. They crossed the Carpathian Mountains and found a new promised land. The vast, fertile plains of the Carpathian Basin, modern-day Hungary. It was perfect for their way of life, and from this secure base, they began to raid. Their objective was not land, not conquest in the European sense. It was wealth, pure and simple. Gold, silver, fine cloth, and slaves. Their strategy was a masterpiece of psychological and economic warfare, perfected over centuries on the steppe. Their signature was speed, surprise, and devastating harassment. A typical raid might involve 2,000 horsemen. They would cross a frontier at night, covering immense distances. By dawn, they would fall upon an unsuspecting monastery, a wealthy market town, or a cluster of undefended villages. Resistance was met with swift, brutal force. Everyone else, every man, woman, and child who could walk or be carried, was rounded up as slaves. Valuables were loaded onto spare horses. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they would vanish back into the landscape. If, by some miracle, a local German count managed to muster his knights and give chase, the real lesson began. The Magyar ponies, though smaller, were tougher and possessed incredible endurance. They could outdistance the heavier European war horses with ease, and if the pursuers closed in, the Magyars would employ their most feared tactic, the Parthian shot. As they feigned retreat, they would twist their bodies fully around in the saddle and loose a volley of arrows backward with terrifying accuracy. Knights would tumble from their mounts. The charge would falter in confusion. And the Magyars would ride on, leaving only dust, corpses, and a deep, lingering terror. Between the years 899 and 955, the Magyars launched over 50 major raids deep into Western Europe. They burned the great monastery of St. Gallen to the ground. They sacked towns in Swabia and Saxony. They crossed the Alps and ravaged northern Italy. They struck deep into Francia, even reaching the outskirts of Paris. They crossed the Pyrenees and raided the Christian kingdoms of Spain. The chronicles of the era are filled with apocalyptic language. They were called the Scourge of God, a divine punishment sent to chastise a sinful and divided Christendom. For the common people living in the borderlands, life became a nightmare of uncertainty. At any moment, without warning, the horizon could darken with riders, and everything you knew could be gone. And the most demoralizing fact of all, there was no unified, effective response. The empire that could have organized such a response, the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, was by the year 900 a political corpse. Charlemagne's grandsons had torn his legacy apart in a series of civil wars, partitioning the realm into three weak and jealous kingdoms. West Francia, the precursor to France, a doomed narrow strip called Middle Francia, and East Francia, which would become Germany. East Francia was in a state of particular disarray. The king was Louis the Child, who was, as his name suggests, a boy of 7. Real power rested with the regional dukes: the Duke of Saxony, the Duke of Swabia, the Duke of Franconia, and Margrave Luitpold of Bavaria, who ruled the southeastern frontier. These men were rivals as much as they were neighbours. They spent as much energy jockeying for power and settling old scores with each other as they did defending their borders. Consequently, when the Magyar raids came, the response was consistently, shamefully predictable. They paid them to go away. Tribute. Danegeld by another name, gold and silver in exchange for a temporary, fragile peace. In the year 900, the Magyars raided Bavaria. Margrave Luitpold, the man who would one day lead the great expedition, paid them a small fortune to leave. In 901, they poured over the Brenner Pass into Italy. The Italian nobles, divided and weak, paid them off. In 904, they struck Saxony. Even the formidable Duke Otto, a man of real military talent, found it easier to open his treasury than to muster a sufficient force to confront them. This pattern repeated for years, and with every chest of coin handed over to a Magyar chieftain, the message was seared into the consciousness of both sides. The Germans could not or would not stop them, but the cost was more than fiscal. It was measured in burned homesteads, in desecrated churches where altar gold was ripped away, in families torn apart, their members destined for slave markets in the East. The psychological toll on the German populace was immense. A deep-seated, chronic fear settled over the eastern duchies. The church, struggling to make sense of the chaos, preached that this was indeed divine retribution for the moral failings of the age. For many, it felt like the end of the world had come. And all the while, the Magyars were not just surviving. They were thriving, evolving. They had settled the Carpathian Basin permanently. They were transitioning from a purely nomadic confederation into a proto-state. They established permanent settlements, cultivated land, and developed a more complex political hierarchy. The raids were no longer a matter of survival. They were state policy, a highly profitable business venture to fund their nascent kingdom, distribute wealth to their warrior aristocracy, and maintain the martial skills that were the bedrock of their identity and security. By the year 906, the German nobility had endured nearly a decade of this relentless humiliation. A decade of watching their people suffer while they stood by, impotent. A decade of seeing their treasuries, the foundation of their power, drained to buy a peace that never lasted. A decade of feeling their own martial honor, the very currency of their authority in a violent world, erode with each tribute payment. For men like Luitpold of Bavaria, whose family, the Luitpoldings, had been entrusted with defending the Danube frontier since the time of Charlemagne, this was an intolerable stain. Something had to break. And then it did. In the autumn of 906, Duke Otto of Saxony, the same man who had once paid tribute, managed to achieve what no one else had. He caught a large Magyar raiding party, laden with plunder and perhaps overconfident, off guard near the river Unstrut. Fighting on ground of his choosing, with the element of surprise, his Saxon knights and footmen delivered a sharp, decisive defeat. Hundreds of Magyar warriors were killed. Their plunder was recovered. It was the first clear, unambiguous German victory in living memory. The psychological impact of this victory cannot be overstated. In the halls of Saxony, Bavaria, and Swabia, a dangerous and intoxicating idea was born. It was a spark in dry tinder. Maybe the Magyars were not invincible demigods after all. Maybe they could be beaten. Maybe if the German dukes could finally set aside their petty rivalries and unite their strength, they could not just defend, but attack. They could march into the heart of Hungary itself, find the Magyar host, and crush the threat at its source, achieving a final, glorious redemption that would erase a decade of shame. This idea, this vision of decisive, cathartic victory, set in motion the inexorable political and military machinery that would lead directly to the fields outside Pressburg. But one tactical victory, however morale-boosting, does not win a strategic war. Otto's success at the Unstrut proved the Magyars could bleed if caught on unfavorable terms. It did not prove that a massive, slow-moving European army could invade their homeland and destroy their main force. There is a vast, deadly chasm between ambushing a raiding party on home ground and conducting a successful invasion of a mobile enemy's core territory, where they hold every advantage of knowledge, supply, and maneuver. Yet, the political and psychological momentum was now unstoppable. News of the victory spread like wildfire. From the stone keeps of Saxony to the wooden halls of Bavaria, a new, aggressive energy took hold. Otto had stood firm. He had fought. He had won. The pressure now shifted onto every other German leader. In the medieval world, a lord's honor and reputation were not abstract concepts. They were the bedrock of his power. His ability to protect his lands, to defend his people, to project strength, determined whether his vassals remained loyal, whether the king respected him, whether he could command obedience in court or on the battlefield. A lord who was seen as weak, who constantly bought peace rather than enforcing it, was a lord living on borrowed time. By 906, men like Margrave Luitpold were running perilously low on this essential currency. He had ruled the southeastern frontier, the region most savagely and frequently ravaged by Magyar incursions, for over a decade. His family's prestige was built on being the shield of Bavaria. But what did he have to show for it? A string of smouldering villages, a treasury depleted by annual tribute, and the silent, judging eyes of his own knights and nobles every time he was forced to negotiate with the enemy. The constant raids were a direct repudiation of his family's reason for being. The Church, a powerful political player in its own right, added its voice to the chorus for action. Archbishop Theotmar of Salzburg, a formidable and ambitious prelate, had been writing impassioned letters to the Pope and his fellow bishops for years. He framed the Magyar raids not just as a military problem, but as a spiritual crisis. They were a punishment from God for Christian disunity and sin. Otto's victory at the Unstrut, Theotmar declared, was a sign of divine favor, a clear indication that God would bless those who took the fight to the pagan invaders. He called for a unified, holy endeavor, a crusade in all but name, pressure built from all directions, political, from rival dukes and restless vassals, personal from a deep well of wounded pride, religious from a powerful churchman framing inaction as impiety. And then came the final catalyst, the piece of intelligence that made action seem not just necessary, but opportune. In 907, the great Magyar leader, Prince Arpad, the architect of their migration and consolidation, died. Leadership passed to his son, Zoltan. He was young, untested. Rumors, perhaps embellished by wishful thinking or genuine Magyar disinformation, reached German ears. There was talk of discord among the seven tribes, of tension between traditionalist warlords who wanted to keep raiding and a newer faction that wanted to focus on building a settled kingdom. To the German dukes, this sounded like classic weakness. It sounded like division. It sounded like a window of opportunity. Their scouts, ranging east, reported that the Magyar settlements seemed lightly defended, that their armies were not massing on the border. The intelligence, such as it was, suggested the Magyars were distracted, internally focused, unprepared for a massive, conventional invasion. If the Germans struck now, with overwhelming concentrated force, they could deliver a decisive, war-ending blow before the enemy knew what was happening. It was the perfect storm of motive and perceived opportunity. The bruised German ego, the political necessity, the religious sanction, and the seeming vulnerability of the foe all aligned. In the winter of 906, the decision was made in all but name. Messengers clad in furs against the cold rode between the courts of Duke Otto in Saxony, Margrave Luitpold in Bavaria, Duke Burkhard of Swabia, and the magnates of Franconia. Even the advisors of the child King Louis were consulted, though his approval was a mere formality. The question was no longer if they would invade, but how to ensure total victory. The answer was a reflection of their fear and their pride. The army had to be colossal, unprecedented. This could not be another border skirmish or a punitive raid. This had to be an avalanche, an irresistible force that would grind the Magyar threat into dust forever. It would be a demonstration of German power that would resound across Europe and secure their borders for a generation. Luitpold, as the lord of the frontier duchy, would have overall command. He had the most experience, however grim, with the enemy. Bavaria shared the longest border with Hungary, and he knew the ground, the river crossings, the ancient Roman roads. Archbishop Theotmar would accompany the army, providing spiritual leadership, moral authority, and the full weight of the church's sanction, turning the campaign into a holy endeavour. Every duchy, every county, every abbey with knights to lend was called upon. The mobilization order went out across East Francia. All able-bodied warriors, all knights owing service, all freemen who could bear arms, were to assemble at Regensburg, the capital of Bavaria, in the spring of 907. From there, the host would follow the great Danube River east, the historic highway into Central Europe, and cross into Magyar lands. The objective was brutally simple. Destroy the key Magyar fortress and settlement at Breslaw-Spurg, modern-day Bratislava. This would secure a vital river crossing and a base of operations. Then, draw the main Magyar army into a pitched battle on open ground, where the heavy German cavalry could deliver its crushing charge and annihilate it. If they succeeded, the raids would cease overnight. The eastern frontier would know peace for the first time in a generation. The German dukes would reclaim their honour, their prestige, and their role as the unquestioned defenders of Christendom. Their names would be sung in halls and churches for centuries, if they failed. The thought was not seriously entertained in the council chambers that winter. Failure with such a host seemed a mathematical impossibility. The very scale of the undertaking was its own guarantee. By early summer of 907, the host began to converge on Regensburg. It was a sight that defied the imagination of the age. Knights arrived in companies, their armour and caparisons a riot of colours and heraldic devices. The air rang with the sound of hammers on anvils as blacksmiths performed last-minute repairs. Infantry columns marched in from the hills and forests, their leaders bellowing orders to keep formation. Wagons by the hundred groaned into the great encampment, piled high with sacks of grain, barrels of salt pork and beer, bundles of arrows, and spare weapons. There were wagons carrying the disassembled parts of catapults and mangonels. There were wagons for the clergy, for the clerks, for the surgeons with their crude but necessary tools. The camp swelled with a vast, unruly tale of camp followers, wives, merchants, prostitutes, and opportunists of every stripe, doubling the apparent size of the multitude. Historians have argued for centuries over the numbers. Contemporary chroniclers, prone to exaggeration, speak of armies like the sands of the sea. Modern analysis, based on logistics, population estimates, and later records, suggests a force between 80 and 120,000 fighting men. For context, this was larger than the army William the Conqueror would use to invade England 60 years later. It was one of the largest military forces ever assembled in medieval Europe. To look upon it from the walls of Regensburg was to behold what seemed to be the embodiment of invincible power. It was a statement written in men and steel. In the great hall of Regensburg, under banners depicting saints and beasts, Luitpold held his final council with the gathered dukes, counts, and bishops. The plan was reiterated, simple and direct. March east along the Danube. Secure the crossing at Bresalauspurg. Draw out the Magyars. Destroy them. Archbishop Theotmar presided over a solemn mass. He blessed the army's standards, the personal banners of every great lord, invoking the protection of the archangels and the saints. Prayers for victory echoed off the stone, a thunderous chorus of male voices. The sense of destiny was palpable. And then, in late June, under a high summer sun, the giant stirred. The army of East Francia began to move. A column miles long, a serpent of humanity and industry, wound its way out of Regensburg and onto the old Roman road that traced the south bank of the Danube. They marched east, toward Hungary, toward what every man in the ranks believed was their date, with glory and a final reckoning. What they did not know, what their commanders had not accounted for, was that their every move was already being tracked. 100 miles to the east, in the rolling hills beyond the river, Magyar scouts, men who lived in the saddle and saw more with a glance than most did in a lifetime, watched the dust cloud on the horizon. They noted the length of the column, the pace, the placement of the baggage train. They counted the banners. And they rode back to report, not with fear, but with cold professional interest. Prince Zoltán, the new leader of the Magyar nation, received these reports. He did not order a mobilization to meet this threat head-on. He gave different orders. Orders of patience, of deception, of lure and entrapment. He was not afraid. He was preparing. The first week of the march had an air of triumphant procession. The sheer scale of their own enterprise was a source of awe and pride. Knights rode in disciplined companies, their mail shimmering, pennants fluttering from lance tips. The infantry, for now, marched with a spring in their step, singing songs of home and hoped for plunder. At every river crossing, every hilltop town, local people came out to watch, to gawk at the passing of what seemed like the armies of legend. Priests traveling with the host held open-air services, blessing the troops and promising them God's favor. Morale was at its zenith. Confidence was an unshakable faith. Luitpold rode near the front of the column with his immediate retinue. His son, Berthold, was at his side, eager for his first great campaign. The senior Bavarian nobles, men like the wary Count Dietmar, were there, along with the commanders of the Swabian and Franconian contingents. Archbishop Theotmar travelled in a covered wagon near the command group, emerging at stops to deliver fiery sermons that framed their march as a new exodus, a journey to purge the pagan from the promised lands of Christendom. But by the second week, the immense, grinding reality of moving such a host began to assert itself. The summer of 907 was hot and humid. The weight of a full harness of mail in such heat was a torturous burden. Men began to discard non-essential gear along the roadside. Water, always the dictator of campaign logistics, became a severe problem. 100,000 men and tens of thousands of animals cannot all drink from the Danube at once. Organized watering points became choke points of chaos and delay. Then came the dust, the tramp of countless feet, the roll of 1,000 wagon wheels, the plod of oxen and horses, churned the dry summer roads into a fine, choking powder that hung in a permanent cloud over the rear half of the army. It coated everything, gritted in eyes, mouths, and food. It was a constant, miserable presence. Discipline, so sharp in Regensburg, began to fray at the edges. Fights broke out in the lines over water rations or marching order. Units from different duchies, their old rivalries simmering just below the surface, traded insults and occasional blows. The vast baggage train, the lifeline of the army, began to lag farther and farther behind. stretched out and vulnerable. But Luitpold pressed the pace. They were still in friendly, or at least neutral, territory. The discomfort, he reasoned, was the price of war. It would be worth it once they crossed into Magyar lands and brought the elusive enemy to a decisive fight. By late July, the character of the land began to change. They entered the easternmost marches, a blurred frontier zone between Bavarian influence and the sway of Slavic tribes allied to, or subjugated by, the Magyars. And here, they encountered the first true strangeness. The villages were empty, not burned, not looted, but simply abandoned. Houses stood with doors open, hearth fires were cold, storage pits were empty, fields had been recently harvested, but there was no one to tend them, no livestock in the pens. It was as if the population had been quietly, efficiently evacuated. Luitpold sent squadrons of light cavalry ahead to scout. Their reports were uniform and unsettling. For miles ahead, the settlements were deserted. The roads were empty of all traffic. The Magyars and their subject peoples had vanished. At first, this was interpreted as the best possible news. Clearly, word of the colossal German army had raced ahead of them. The enemy was fleeing in terror, perhaps retreating deep into the Hungarian plains to make a final stand. Perhaps they were abandoning their borderlands altogether. This was a sign of weakness, of fear. It meant their strategy was working. But some of the older, more seasoned commanders felt a deep disquiet. Count Dietmar, the Bavarian noble who had fought skirmishes on this frontier for 20 years, sought a private audience with Luitpold. His face was grim. "My lord, they are watching us," he said, his voice low. Luitpold frowned. "The scouts report no contact, Dietmar. The land is empty." "Precisely," Dietmar replied. "Think on it. We have been on the march for weeks. We are now deep in territory they have raided and controlled for a decade. And we have not seen a single Magyar scout. Not a solitary rider on the horizon. They are the finest light horsemen in the world. Do you believe they are blind? Or do you believe they know exactly where we are, how fast we move, how many we are, and they are letting us come? Deeper and deeper." Luitpold was silent for a long moment. The logic was cold and sharp. It made terrible sense. The Magyars' greatest strength was their intelligence and mobility. Their absence was more threatening than their presence. "What is your counsel, then?" Luitpold asked. Dietmar met his gaze. "We are overextended. Our supplies are stretching thin. The men are weary. We should halt. Fortify a strong position here, near the frontier. Use it as a base. Send out strong, fast patrols to find their army and force it to react to us, on ground we choose. Do not march blindly into the heart of their country." It was sound, conservative, professional military advice, but Luitpold saw not the military logic, but the political and personal catastrophe it represented. To halt now, after mobilizing all Germany, after the grand sermons and the promises of a crusading victory, would be seen as weakness, even cowardice. The other dukes would mock him. Thiotmar would decry a failure of faith. His own vassals would question his leadership. The pressure that had built to launch this campaign now worked inexorably against any course that seemed like hesitation. "We have come too far to turn back or stop now," Luitpold said finally, his voice firm. "The enemy flees before us. We will press on to our objective, take Breslau-Spurg, and establish our base there. Then we will see." Dietmar nodded, a gesture of resignation rather than agreement. The die was cast. By early August, the army reached the broad plain where the river Morava flows into the Danube. On a strategic rise near the confluence stood their target, Breslau-Spurg. It was a Slavic fortified settlement, a large wooden palisade atop earthen ramparts, now held and strengthened by a Magyar garrison. Taking it would give the Germans control of a vital river crossing and a formidable strongpoint from which to dominate the region. Surely, the Magyars would have to fight for it. But as the army deployed from its marching column into a vast siege camp, the same profound silence from the empty villages persisted. The land around the fortress was still, eerily so. No birds seemed to sing, no distant herds moved on the plains. A heavy, waiting quiet pressed down on the host. Scout reports were now anxious, confused. Yes, Magyar banners were visible on the walls of Pressburg. The garrison was clearly present, but estimates put their number at only a few hundred, perhaps 1,000 men. Where was the main Magyar army? Where were the tens of thousands of horsemen Prince Zoltán could summon? They were not arrayed on the plain to defend the fort. They were not visible anywhere. Luitpold called a war council in his command tent. The atmosphere was tense. Some commanders, young and eager for glory, argued for an immediate, overwhelming assault on the fort. Take it swiftly, then use it as a sally port to launch deeper raids and finally force the Magyar army to reveal itself. Others, more cautious, advised a formal siege. Surround the fort, build earthworks, use their superior numbers and engineering to take it with minimal losses, then wait securely inside its walls for the enemy to come to them. Archbishop Theotmar listened, then stood. His voice was calm, imbued with absolute certainty. My lords, you search for shadows where there is only light. God has delivered this stronghold into our hands. The enemy quails before his host. They abandon their own borderlands. They hide behind wooden walls. This is not a ruse. It is fear, divine terror. We must not falter now. We must strike with the full force of our righteous anger and take this place. Then we shall burn their fields and return to our homes as the champions of Christ, our mission accomplished. His words, blending religious zeal with the promise of an easy victory, carried the day. Luitpold, perhaps swayed by Theotmar's confidence, perhaps feeling he had no other politically viable choice, gave the order. They would lay siege to Pressburg and take it by storm. On August 2nd, the German army arrayed itself for siege. Engineers and levied peasants began digging lines of circumvallation, trenches to encircle the fort and protect the besiegers. Others started assembling the great siege engines carried in the wagons. Towers taller than the palisade were pieced together from pre-cut timber. Catapults and mangonels were positioned on raised mounds. Cavalry patrols rode wide circuits around the perimeter, guarding against any surprise relief force. On August 3rd, they began in earnest. A contingent of Bavarian knights, eager to prove themselves, advanced toward the main gate in a show of force, testing the defences. They moved at a trot, lances upright. The response from the walls was instantaneous and violent. A cloud of arrows arced down, not a ragged volley, but a sharp, concentrated hail. The composite bows thrummed, and the arrows fell with a force that punched through mail and shield. Horses screamed and fell. Knights crashed to the earth, some dead, many wounded. The survivors, shields bristling with arrow shafts, retreated in disarray. The defenders on the walls had not panicked. They had not shouted insults. They had simply fired, with a calm, chilling precision. That night, Luitpold stood outside his pavilion, staring at the countless campfires of his own army and the smaller, defiant cluster of lights within Pressburg. He had the numbers. He had the machines. He had, according to his archbishop, the mandate of heaven. Why then did Count Dietmar's warning echo in his mind like a funeral bell? Why did this silent, watching land feel more dangerous than any battlefield? Unseen in the darkness, a Magyar scout lay on his belly on a hilltop a mile to the south. He had been there since dusk, observing the German camp, noting the positions of the command tents, the horse lines, the supply dumps. When he was satisfied, he slithered backward, found his pony tethered in a gully, and rode east through the night. By morning, he was before Prince Zoltan. The young leader listened intently to the detailed report, asking few questions. When the scout finished, Zoltan allowed himself a thin, cold smile. He turned to his chieftains, the leaders of the 7 tribes. "Let them have their siege," he said, his voice quiet. "Let them exhaust themselves against the walls. Let them consume their supplies. Let them think they are winning, that we are afraid." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the gathered warriors. "When they are tired, when they are hungry, when they are deep in our land and far from their homes, then we will close the door. Then we will kill them all." The siege of Pressburg lasted 12 days. Each day was a slow, grinding lesson in frustration and attrition that the German High Command stubbornly refused to learn. On August 4th, Luitpold ordered the siege engines into action. Catapults hurled stones that thudded against the wooden palisade, shaking it but not breaking it. Battering rams, protected by mobile roofs called sows, were wheeled toward the main gate. Magyar archers on the walls focused a murderous fire on the crews. Men fell, replaced by others who soon joined them on the ground. The rams advanced in fits and starts. Finally, a mighty crash echoed as the first ram struck the gate. The gate shuddered but held. The defenders rained down not just arrows, but stones, boiling water, and burning pitch. By nightfall, the Germans had lost 50 men and had not breached a single wall. The cost was disproportionate, but was dismissed as the necessary price of a siege. August 5th delivered a sharp, painful lesson in Magyar tactics. Just before dawn, as sentries changed and the camp was at its sleepiest, the gates of Pressburg swung silently open. 200 Magyar horsemen, not the light skirmishers usually seen, but heavier cavalry, burst forth in a compact, savage sally. They hit the German siege lines like a thunderclap. They cut down the night watch, set one of the nearly completed wooden towers ablaze with fire arrows, and wheeled in a tight formation to slash through a cluster of engineer tents before galloping back through the gates, which slammed shut behind them. The entire attack lasted less than 10 minutes. The German camp was left in stunned, chaotic uproar. Knights scrambled for their horses, but the raiders were gone. The message was unequivocal. The men inside were not desperate defenders. They were confident, aggressive, and in control. Luitpold's fury was palpable. On August 6th, determined to break the stalemate, he ordered a full-scale infantry assault. Hundreds of foot soldiers, protected by large shields, rushed forward carrying scaling ladders. They placed them against the walls under a deafening hail of projectiles. Men climbed, only to be pushed backward, their ladders tipped over or cut down the moment their heads appeared over the palisade. A handful of Germans fought their way onto the wall walk, creating a small, bloody foothold. It lasted less than a minute before a countercharge of Magyar warriors wielding sabers and axes cleared it. The assault was broken after 4 hours of brutal, close-quarter fighting. 80 more Germans died. The walls remained unbreached. That night, the War Council convened again in a somber mood. Thiotmar spoke of Job, of trials sent by God to test the faithful, but Count Dietmar had no patience for theology. "We have been here 6 days," he stated, his voice flat. "We have lost over 130 of our best men, and we are no closer to taking this pile of timber than we were when we arrived. And I will ask the question again, that no one wishes to answer. Where is the Magyar army, the real army? We marched here to fight the might of Hungary. Instead, we are grinding the edge off our own sword against a fort held by a few hundred determined archers. Does this seem right to any of you?" An uncomfortable silence filled the tent. A young Franconian count spoke up. "Bait? You think this is bait, Dietmar? For an army of 100,000, even if every Magyar warrior in the world appeared on that plain tomorrow, we would crush them in open battle. Our knights would ride them down." "Would they?" Dietmar shot back, his temper fraying. Look around you. We cannot even take a simple wooden fort. Our men are exhausted from the march. Our supplies are dwindling. Every day we sit here, we grow weaker and the Magyars grow stronger, wherever they are. They are not in that fort. They are out there. He gestured wildly toward the dark landscape beyond the campfires. They are watching us bleed. Luitpold silenced the argument with a raised hand. His face was drawn. We finish what we started, he said, his voice firm but lacking its earlier conviction. We have committed. To turn back now is impossible. We take Brezilauspurg, then we will see. But the seed of doubt, once planted, began to grow. The next 5 days, from August 7th to the 11th, were a blur of grinding, costly, and futile assaults. The heat was relentless. Food began to run low. The foragers sent out to strip the already harvested countryside returned with little, and some did not return at all. Morale, once so high, began to curdle into a sullen, anxious exhaustion. The army was being drained not by battle, but by the slow, relentless pressure of the siege and the hostile environment. Then, on August 12th, the strategic picture shifted dramatically. Scouts, riding wider patrols than usual, returned at a gallop. Their news sent a chill through the command staff. Magyar forces had been sighted. Not within Brezilauspurg. Outside. To the south and east, in the wooded hills and along the river valleys. Large bodies of cavalry, thousands strong, moving with purpose but not attacking. They were shadowing the German siege camp, maintaining a distance of several miles. Luitpold dispatched his best light cavalry, his few scouts who could match the Magyars for horsemanship, on a dangerous reconnaissance mission. They returned hours later, their faces pale beneath the dust. The reports were alarming and precise. At least 10,000 Magyar horse archers, perhaps many more, were dispersed in the terrain surrounding the German position. They were not hiding. They were positioned on ridge lines, in tree lines, in clear view. One scout, a Bavarian borderer who spoke a little of the Slavic tongue, had captured a straggler. Before the man died of his wounds, he had said through gritted teeth, "You are in a bowl, and the rim is sharp." That night, the war council was shrouded in a gloom thicker than the tent canvas. "We are surrounded," Dietmar stated, no longer arguing, simply stating a fact. "Not surrounded," a Swabian duke countered weakly. "They are observing. They keep their distance. The road west is still open. We could still withdraw in good order if we chose." "For now," Dietmar replied, his voice dripping with weary scorn. "But what happens the moment we pack up this camp and start back the way we came? Do you imagine they will wave us farewell, or will they fall upon our column, stretched out for miles on that same road? They will harry our flanks, pick off our stragglers, attack our baggage train. They will turn our retreat into a running slaughter. We are too deep. We are too slow." Archbishop Theotmar rose, his vestments seeming to glow in the lamplight. "Enough of this talk of retreat. We came here under God's eye to destroy the pagan threat, and that is what we shall do. If they wish to face us in open battle, then thanks be to the Lord. He has answered our prayers. Our knights, the finest in Christendom, will break their light horsemen on the anvil of our faith. This is the moment we have marched for. This is the test." Luitpold was trapped. Theotmar's words spoke to the crusading ideal, to the very reason for the campaign. To retreat now would be to admit the entire endeavour was a catastrophic error, a sin against God and a blow to his honour from which he would never recover. But Dietmar's warning was the voice of cold military reality. He looked at the faces of his commanders, seeing fear, determination, and stubborn pride in equal measure. "We cannot turn back," he said finally, the words tasting of ash. "We have taken losses. But we still have an overwhelming army. We will finish the siege. We will take Brezalausburg. Then we will face whatever they send against us from a position of strength. It was a decision born of political necessity and sunk cost fallacy, not sound strategy. On August 15th, the Feast of the Assumption, Luitpold ordered a final, all-out assault on Brezalausburg. Every available man was committed. The remaining siege engines hurled their last stones. Fresh troops swarmed the walls from three sides. It was a brutal, chaotic, close-quarter melee that raged for hours. The Magyar defenders, finally outnumbered at the point of attack, fought with a ferocious, desperate skill. But numbers told. In the late afternoon, a section of the palisade, weakened by days of bombardment, gave way with a splintering crash. German infantry poured through the breach. The fighting inside the walls was house to house, alley by alley, but by dusk, the settlement was theirs. The surviving Magyar defenders, perhaps a few hundred, withdrew in good order across a ford in the Morava River and vanished into the gathering twilight. The German soldiers raised their banners on the broken walls. A cheer went up, but it was thin, exhausted, devoid of triumph. They had won a ruin. Luitpold walked through the captured fort. It was a charnel house. His men were bloodied, spent, their eyes hollow. They had lost nearly 400 men to take a position of questionable strategic value, a pile of smoking timber. And now, as night fell, new points of light began to sparkle on the encircling hills. Not the scattered fires of a defeated foe, but the organized campfires of an army taking up deliberate positions. A perfect, unbroken ring of light now surrounded the German host, pinpricks of orange in the vast darkness. In that moment, standing in the center of Brezalausburg, Luitpold understood the terrible truth with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. The siege had never been about holding the fort. It had been a delay, a fixative, a piece of bait to keep the German giant in one place, to make it exhaust its strength against an immovable object, to drain its supplies and, most importantly, to dull its will. The Magyars had used the fort and its gallant garrison as a lure, as sacrifice to pin the German army deep in hostile territory, weary, bloodied, and now completely encircled. The real battle, the battle the Magyars had chosen and for which they had prepared, was only just beginning. He gave his army 2 days to rest within the captured, stinking ruins of Brezalausburg. They looted what little the defenders had left behind, mostly spoiled grain and broken weapons. The plan, such as it was to regroup, redistribute what supplies remained, and decide the next move. Press deeper east to find the Magyar heartland, or begin a fighting withdrawal back to Bavaria, using the fort as a temporary stronghold. But the initiative had been irrevocably lost. On the night of August 17th, the Magyar army moved. It happened in the deep, moonless dark before dawn. There were no trumpet calls, no shouted orders, no drumbeats, just the soft, countless rustle of thousands of hooves on grass, the creak of leather, the occasional snort of a pony. They moved like a dark tide flowing across the landscape, guided by an instinctive, pre-arranged plan. They split into multiple columns, each with a specific, lethal purpose. One large force swept north in a wide arc, crossing the Danube at a ford upstream and positioning itself astride the main road back to Bavaria, the German army's only line of retreat and supply. Another force crossed the Danube to the south, blocking escape in that direction and any hope of linking up with potential Slavic allies. A third, perhaps the largest, moved east and then north, completing the circle, interposing itself between the Germans and the interior of the Magyar lands. By the time the first grey light of dawn touched the sky on August 18th, the encirclement was not a tactical possibility. It was a physical, inescapable fact. The trap was shut. The German army was in a bag, and the drawstrings were pulled tight. A German scout, who had been on a patrol in the pre-dawn murk, galloped into camp just as the sun breached the horizon. His horse was lathered, its eyes rolling white. He threw himself from the saddle and stumbled to Luitpold's command post, his words tumbling out in a panicked stream. "My lord, they are everywhere! Everywhere!" Luitpold and his commanders, roused from a fitful sleep, rushed out. "What do you mean, everywhere? Report properly, man." The scout pointed a trembling hand north, toward the road home. "Magyar cavalry, thousands of them, formed up, not 2 miles out, on the high ground." He swung his arm to the south. "More there, on the far bank of the Danube. Banners, many banners." He pointed east, into the rising sun. "And there, horse archers, spread across the plain as far as I could see." Finally, he pointed west, the direction they had come from, the direction of salvation. "And behind us, on the ridges we passed yesterday, they are there too." A profound silence fell over the group. Count Dietmar broke it, his voice a dry rasp. "I told you, we are encircled." Archbishop Theotmar, emerging from his tent, shook his head, a gesture of denial. "It is an illusion, a show of force to frighten us. They have seen the size of our host. They will not dare to attack a formed army in its camp. They are pagans. They understand only strength. We must show them our resolve." But Luitpold was no longer listening to the archbishop. He was calculating, the cold arithmetic of survival. His army was exhausted from weeks of marching and a brutal, costly siege. Supplies were critically low, perhaps 3 days of hard bread and sour wine left. Morale was a fragile thing, ready to shatter. And they were surrounded, on ground chosen by the enemy, by a force whose size and disposition were unknown, but clearly capable of moving with terrifying speed and coordination. Every advantage they had possessed at Regensburg was gone. They had traded mobility for a ruin, numerical superiority for a surrounded, static position, and the initiative for desperate reaction. He turned to his commanders, his face set. "Order a battle. Form the army into a defensive square, a great hollow square, all infantry to the perimeter. Lock shields, spears outward, archers and crossbowmen positioned at the corners and at intervals along the line. All remaining cavalry, every knight who can still sit a horse, form up in the centre as a mobile reserve. The baggage train, what's left of it, and the wounded, in the very centre. We will hold formation. We will present a wall of steel they cannot penetrate. They will have to come to us, and when they do, our knights will break them." It was a textbook response, the classic, time-honoured answer to the threat of nomadic horse archers, inherited from the Roman legions. A dense, disciplined infantry square was a fortress on the march, a hedgehog that could not be charged. It relied on discipline, mutual protection, and the hope that the enemy would eventually be forced to close to melee range, where German armour and training would prevail. But the Magyars had studied this textbook too, and they had written a different final chapter. By mid-morning, the first Magyar units appeared on the low ridges surrounding the vast German square. They did not form neat, European-style battle lines. They appeared in loose, fluid groups of 30 to 50 riders, spreading out along the entire circumference. They began to canter, then to gallop. Not toward the square, but parallel to it, maintaining a distance of about 300 paces, just beyond the effective range of the German crossbows and longbows. They moved in a continuous, swirling, mesmerizing dance around the static German formation. Then the arrows began to fall. It was not a single crashing volley. It was a continuous, deadly drizzle that became a downpour. A group of Magyars would gallop along a face of the square. As they passed, each rider would loose 2, 3, sometimes 4 arrows in a high, arching trajectory before wheeling away. Then another group would sweep in from a different angle, and another. The arrows fell into the packed German formation with a sound like terrible rain. Thud, thud, thud. Into shields, into dirt, into flesh. Men raised their shields overhead, forming a testudo, but the square was too large, the coordination imperfect. Arrows found gaps. A soldier covering his head would take one in the leg and collapse. A man protecting his body would be hit in the shoulder or neck. The arrows were not the heavy, slow bolts of a crossbow. They were lighter, faster, and fired in such volume that they wore down the defense through sheer accumulation. Horses in the central reserve, targets too tempting to ignore, were hit and panicked, rearing and bolting through the ranks, causing chaos and trampling men. The air grew thick with dust, with the screams of wounded men and animals, with the incessant whistle of incoming arrows. The German archers and crossbowmen tried to reply. They loosed volleys at the circling riders, but the range was at the extreme edge of their capability. Most arrows fell short, kicking up dirt harmlessly. The few that reached the Magyar line were easily avoided by the agile ponies or deflected by the small, light shields the riders carried. The Magyar composite bow simply outranged and outshot the European weapons of the day. It was a mismatch. Luitpold, from his position in the centre, watched this deadly dance with growing horror. He had to act. He could not let his army be shot to pieces without response. He ordered a cavalry charge. The heavy knights, the decisive weapon, would break this harassment. 500 Bavarian knights, the core of his personal retinue, mounted their massive destriers. Lances were levelled, shields brought up. With a thunderous roar, they charged out of the square toward a dense concentration of Magyar horsemen to the northeast. The ground shook under the weight of the charge. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight, the culmination of centuries of martial tradition. The Magyar band saw them coming. They did not form a line to receive the charge. They simply turned their ponies and rode away, scattering like birds before a hawk. Their lighter, faster mounts opened the distance with ease, and as they retreated, they performed their signature maneuver. Turning almost fully around in their saddles, they loosed a backward volley. Arrows slammed into the charging knights. Horses went down, crashing and rolling, throwing their riders. The charge lost its cohesion, slowing to a confused trot as knights tried to avoid the fallen, and the Magyar arrows continued to fall among them. Exhausted, far from the safety of the square, and unable to close with the enemy, the knights had no choice but to turn back. That was the moment the Magyars chose to strike. They wheeled their ponies in a tight turn and swept back in from three sides, firing at point-blank range into the scattered, vulnerable knights. It was a slaughter. Knights in full plate were knocked from their saddles by multiple impacts. By the time the shattered remnants of the charge struggled back into the German square, they had lost nearly 100 men and accomplished nothing except to deplete their best cavalry and prove their tactical impotence. Luitpold ordered more charges. To the south, to the west. Each met with the same result. The Magyars would not stand. They would retreat, maintaining distance, firing all the while, draining the strength from the German horses and the resolve from the German riders. Each failed charge left a handful of the army's best warriors dead on the plain, and a growing sense of helplessness in the ranks. This lethal, one-sided exchange continued all through the long, agonizing day of August 18th. The German square, once a symbol of invincible order, began to resemble a pincushion. Arrows stood embedded in shields, in wagon sides, in the ground like some ghastly crop. The perimeter was littered with the dead and the dying, men who had stood their ground until an arrow found a gap. The summer sun beat down, compounding the misery. Water within the square ran out. Men began to succumb to heat and thirst, as much as to arrows. The stench of blood, excrement, and fear became overwhelming. The Magyars suffered negligible losses. They operated in shifts, some groups engaging while others rested their horses and replenished their quivers from supply trains kept safely out of range. Their discipline was impeccable. This was not a wild, frenzied attack. It was a professional, systematic dismantling of a larger force, a clinical application of superior mobility and firepower. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the plain, Luitpold stood in what was left of the square's centre. His men were beyond exhaustion. They were broken in spirit. They had been under a constant, deadly rain for 10 hours and had not traded a single sword blow with the enemy. They had not seen a Magyar face up close. This was not battle as they understood it. It was a massacre in slow motion, a demonstration of their own irrelevance. Count Dietmar approached, an arrow shaft protruding from his left shoulder. He had refused to have it removed. His face was grey with pain and dust. "We cannot survive another day of this," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "If we stay in this square, they will shoot us until there is no one left standing. They have all the time in the world. We have no water, no food tomorrow. The men will break before noon." Luitpold knew he was right. The defensive square, their last hope, had become a death trap. It made them a static target. Their one remaining chance, a slim and desperate one, was to break out, to concentrate every ounce of remaining strength into a spearhead and smash through the Magyar ring to the west, back toward Bavaria. It would mean abandoning the wounded, the baggage, all pretense of order. It would be a bloody, chaotic sprint for survival. But it was the only option left that offered even a ghost of a hope. He gathered his surviving commanders. Their faces were haggard, eyes haunted. The plan was simple, born of desperation. At first light, they would form a narrow, deep column, a giant wedge. All remaining cavalry, every knight who could still ride, would form the tip. The most disciplined infantry would pack in behind them, as tightly as possible. They would abandon everything. The siege engines, the wagons, the treasure, the wounded. They would charge west, toward the road home, and they would not stop for anything. They would punch a hole through the Magyar line and keep running until they reached friendly territory or died trying. That night, in the German camp, there was a profound, terrible silence. No songs were sung. Few prayers were whispered. Men huddled in small groups, staring into the darkness, or simply lay on the ground, waiting for the dawn and what it would bring. Out beyond their lines, the ring of Magyar campfires burned, a perfect, unbroken circle of orange dots in the blackness, a necklace of light around a condemned host. They moved in the cold grey light just before sunrise, hoping for a sliver of surprise. The plan relied on shock, on concentrated, brutal force. The cavalry formed the spear point, a dense mass of perhaps 2,000 knights, the last of the German heavy horse. Their armour was dented, their banners torn, but that they were still a formidable instrument of shock combat. Behind them, the infantry packed into a column 10 men wide, but stretching back for what seemed like miles. A serpent of desperate humanity. Archbishop Theotmar, his vestments filthy, held a gilded cross aloft at the very front, offering a final, silent blessing. Luitpold mounted his horse. His son, Berthold, was beside him, his young face set in a mask of grim determination. No speeches were made. There were no words left. Luitpold raised his sword, pointed it west toward home, and spurred his horse forward. The sound was like the end of the world. 2,000 heavy cavalry launching into a full gallop is a force that shakes the earth. A vast, rolling thunder of hooves. A colossal cloud of dust erupted, obscuring the rear of the column. They aimed for what their scouts had guessed was the weakest point in the Magyar ring, due west. The Magyar forces in their path, as fluid as ever, seemed to melt away. They scattered, opening a wide gap. For one glorious, heart-lifting moment, as the German cavalry vanguard surged through the opening onto the open ground beyond, it seemed the desperate gamble had worked. A ragged cheer went up from the infantry column as it surged forward into the gap. They were going to make it. They were going to break through. Then the gap closed. It happened with a speed and coordination that spoke of meticulous planning. The Magyar horsemen who had scattered did not flee. They flowed north and south, like water around a stone. And from those directions, The main Magyar columns, held in reserve for this exact moment, converged. They did not attack the cavalry spearhead, which was already breaking clear. They struck the long, vulnerable, utterly exposed body of the infantry column. They hit it, in the middle, with the force of a hammer. Arrows poured into the packed ranks from both sides at point-blank range. At that distance, even leather armor was useless. Men fell in swathes, as if scythed down. The column buckled, then shattered. The neat, 10-man-wide formation disintegrated into 100 panicked clusters. Units on the flanks tried to turn and face the attack, which only created more confusion, breaking the cohesion further. The Magyars swarmed around these isolated clumps, circling them like wolves around wounded prey, firing arrow after arrow into the press. Others rode down the road, ahead of the fleeing mass, setting up new positions to fire into the front of the column as it stumbled forward. Chaos, total and absolute, took command. Luitpold, now half a mile ahead with the cavalry vanguard, heard the cacophony of screams, the terror that had a different pitch than battle cries. He turned in his saddle. The sight that met his eyes would haunt him for the brief moments he had left to live. The column was gone. In its place was a sprawling, nightmarish panorama of slaughter. The center of his army was a seething mass of men running in all directions, pursued by Magyar horsemen who cut them down with casual, contemptuous ease. The ordered breakout had become a rout, and a rout against the Magyars was a death sentence. In that instant, Luitpold made the decision that defined his final moments and cemented his historical legacy. He turned the cavalry around. "We go back!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Reform the line! Save the men!" It was the act of a commander, a leader refusing to abandon his army to destruction. It was also, from a cold tactical perspective, suicide. The Bavarian knights, their horses already blown from the initial charge, wheeled with a groaning effort and charged back into the hell they had just escaped. They tried to drive the Magyar skirmishers away from the panicked infantry, to carve out pockets of safety, to impose some shred of order. But the Magyars would not engage them. They flitted away like phantoms, only to swirl back the moment the knights turned to aid another group. The German warhorses, pushed beyond all endurance, began to stumble and collapse, their great hearts giving out. Knights found themselves on foot, surrounded, fighting isolated, doomed battles. By mid-morning on August 20th, the Battle of Pressburg ceased to be a battle in any conventional sense. It became a hunt, a systematic clearing operation across miles of river plain. The German army had shattered into hundreds of small, isolated pockets, each fighting its own futile, final struggle. Some groups of infantry, veterans with steady nerves, managed to form tight shield walls, presenting a bristling hedge of spears. The Magyars simply circled them, firing arrows, waiting for the wall to weaken, for a man to drop, then closing in for the kill. Some men, seeing the hopelessness, threw down their weapons and knelt, begging for mercy in languages their killers did not understand. A few, the young and strong, were taken as slaves, roped together for the march east. Most were killed where they knelt. A swift saber cut to the neck. Some tried to flee to the Danube, thinking to swim across to the northern shore and escape. They drowned in their heavy mail, or were picked off by arrows as they thrashed in the water, turning the river's edge red. The knights, the embodiment of European martial pride, were systematically hunted. Small bands of Magyar horsemen would isolate a single knight, surround him and fire arrows from all directions until he toppled from the saddle, a steel-clad pincushion. Then they would move on to the next. Count Dietmar died trying to protect a group of fleeing Swabian foot soldiers. He took an arrow in the throat. His last act a defiant swing of his sword that caught nothing but air. Duke Burkhard of Swabia fought on foot after his horse was killed, a giant in battered plate, until he was finally pulled down and overwhelmed by a dozen Magyar warriors. Luitpold's son, Berthold, fighting near his father, took an arrow through the cheek. He reeled in his saddle, blood gushing. A second arrow, fired from almost point-blank range, smashed through his breastplate and into his chest. He made no sound, simply slumping forward over his horse's neck before sliding slowly to the ground. Luitpold saw him fall. A raw animal sound tore from his throat. He tried to fight his way toward his son's body, but the tide of chaos, death, and fleeing men was too great. His remaining household knights, seeing their lord's anguish and the hopelessness of the situation, physically seized his horse's bridle and pulled him away. "My lord, we must go. It is over." But there was nowhere to go. By noon, the organized resistance had ended. Luitpold himself, with a final remnant of his personal guard, perhaps 300 knights and men at arms, found themselves backed against a sharp bend of the Danube, their retreat cut off, their front a solid wall of Magyar horsemen. Archbishop Theotmar was with them, his gilded cross now clutched like a weapon, his face smeared with dirt and blood. They dismounted. The horses were finished. The knights formed one last, desperate circle, locking shields, presenting a grim ring of steel and defiance to the enemy that now closed in from all sides. The Magyars did not charge. They halted just beyond lance reach, a silent, watching semicircle of riders. Then, with a calm that was more terrifying than any battle cry, they began to fire. The arrows fell in steady, rhythmic waves. Not a wild barrage, but a measured, professional execution. Shields splintered under the repeated impacts. Men grunted as arrows found the gaps between shield and helm, between breastplate and tasset. One by one, the knights fell, pulled back into the shrinking circle by their comrades as they died, to keep the formation intact. A young knight beside Luitpold, his face still soft with youth, turned to him, his eyes wide with a terror beyond words. "My lord, what do we do?" Luitpold looked at the boy. He had no answer, no tactic, no inspiration, no divine intervention came to him. All the certainties of his life had been stripped away on this field. He placed a hand on the boy's steel-clad shoulder. "Hold the line," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Hold the line." An arrow took the boy in the throat a moment later. He collapsed without a sound. The circle shrank with each passing minute. Theotmar stood in the center, praying loudly, his voice rising above the whistle of any arrows and the thud of impacts. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." An arrow struck him high in the chest, punching through embroidered silk and into the flesh beneath. He staggered, looked down at the feathered shaft in disbelief, then gripped his cross tighter and continued, his voice growing fainter. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven." A second arrow hit him in the stomach. He gasped, fell to his knees, the cross slipping from his nerveless fingers. He crawled forward, grasping for it, his lips still moving. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." His hand closed on the cross. "Amen." Then he pitched forward onto his face, still. Luitpold felt the impact before the pain, a hard, jarring thump in his left side, just below the ribs. He looked down and saw the arrow shaft, the fletching vibrating. In a numb, reflexive gesture, he grasped it and pulled. A mistake. A hot, wet gush followed the shaft out. He dropped to one knee, pressing his gauntleted hand against the wound, feeling his lifeblood pulse between his fingers. Another arrow slammed into his shoulder, the point grating on bone. Another hit his thigh. His strength bled out into the Danube mud. The sounds of the battle faded, replaced by a roaring in his ears. The last thing he saw was the great river, flowing calmly, indifferently past. A slate-grey ribbon under a leaden sky. Then a final arrow struck him in the throat. Margrave Luitpold of Bavaria, commander of the last great army of the Carolingian age, died on his knees in a foreign field, his mission a catastrophic failure, his heir dead beside him, his host annihilated. The man who had set out to secure his legacy had instead presided over its absolute and final end. The Magyars moved in once the last movement in the circle had ceased. They worked with a brisk, emotionless efficiency. They stripped the bodies of the nobles of their fine armor, their jeweled swords, their gold rings and cloak pins. Usable mail and weapons were collected. The rest they left for the carrion birds that were already circling in patient black spirals overhead. The wounded who showed any promise were roped together as slaves. The rest were given a quick, merciless end. Prince Zoltan rode across the field later in the afternoon, surveying the scene of total victory. One of his chieftains, gesturing toward the west, asked if they should pursue the scant few Germans who had perhaps escaped during the initial chaos of the breakout. Zoltan shook his head. "Let them go," he said, his voice quiet. "Let them tell the story." He understood that the story was the ultimate weapon. The legend of the army of 100,000 that marched into Hungary and vanished would guard the Magyar borders more effectively than any wall or garrison. Fear would be their sentinel. In the German duchies, they waited through the end of August and into September. The harvest was gathered. Life continued its daily rhythm. But in every castle, every village along the eastern marches, people watched the road from the east, waiting for news, for the return of fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. The first week, there was no concern. Campaigns took time. The second week, a faint unease began to stir. Had any messengers come? The third week, the unease hardened into a cold, gnawing dread. Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Then, in early September, the first survivor stumbled into a Bavarian village near Passau. He was on foot, barefoot, his clothes in tatters, a festering wound in his side. He collapsed at the village well, babbling incoherently. When he finally could form words, they were two. All dead. The villagers, thinking him mad or fevered, pressed him. He looked at them with hollow eyes. The Margrave, the Archbishop, the Duke of Swabia, all the knights, all the men, they are all dead. The Hungarians, they filled the sky with arrows. He was not believed. One man's ravings were not proof. But then another arrived. And another, and another. Over the next fortnight, fewer than 100 men, from an army of thousands, found their way back to German soil. Most were lowly infantry who had fled into the woods during the breakout and somehow evaded the Magyar patrols. A handful were knights who had abandoned their armor and horses and run for their lives. Every story was the same. A tale of encirclement, of a relentless arrow storm, of a trap from which there was no escape, of a field littered with German dead as far as the eye could see. The confirmation spread like a plague, carrying a paralysis of grief and terror. In Regensburg, Luitpold's wife waited in the palace until the reports from the survivors could no longer be denied. She collapsed. Within the year, she was dead. Some said of a broken heart, others whispered of a self-administered poison. In villages across Bavaria, Swabia, and Franconia, families were utterly obliterated. A blacksmith who had gone with his 3 sons, gone. A freeholder who had marched with his neighbors, gone. An entire generation of military, aged men from some communities was simply erased. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no closure. Only a yawning permanent absence. Churches held masses for the dead, but they felt hollow, performed for ghosts. Priests struggled for words. How do you explain a disaster of such biblical scale? How do you comfort a kingdom that has lost not just an army, but its future leadership, its wealth, and its confidence? Some fell back on the old explanation, calling it God's punishment for collective sin. Others whispered of betrayal, of Magyar sorcery, of anything that could make the incomprehensible comprehensible. The truth was simpler, and more terrifying for those in power. The Germans had been outthought, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by an enemy they had profoundly underestimated. And now that enemy was stronger than ever, for the one force that could have opposed them was gone. The Magyars did not pause. In 908, they launched the largest and most devastating raid yet into a defenseless Bavaria. There was no army to stop them. They burned and looted at will. Some towns, knowing resistance was futile, simply opened their gates and paid tribute on the spot. Luitpold's successor, a relative named Arnulf, tried to organize a defense, but he had no men, no resources, and a nobility decimated and demoralized. He had no choice. He negotiated. He agreed to pay the Magyars an annual tribute in silver, effectively making Bavaria a tributary state. The same pattern repeated across the German duchies. Without a unified military, without strong central leadership, the region descended into political chaos. Petty nobles fought over the spoils of the dead. The church's authority was shaken. And in 911, King Louis the Child, the last Carolingian ruler of East Francia, died. He was 18. Some records say of illness. Others hint darkly at foul play in the anarchic aftermath of Pressburg. With his death, the Carolingian dynasty in Germany ended. The Empire of Charlemagne, the political structure that had defined Western Europe for over a century, was finally irrevocably finished. What followed was a decade-long power vacuum. The German dukes fought amongst themselves for the title of king. The church scrambled to maintain some semblance of order, and the Magyars kept raiding, year after punishing year. For the next 5 decades, they would be the scourge of God, terrorizing Central Europe. They raided as far west as Burgundy, as far south as Rome itself, as far north as Bremen. No one could stop them because the memory of Pressburg was a paralyzing ghost. Do not march east. Do not fight the Magyars on their terms. Do not believe that numbers and armor guarantee victory. It was not until the year 955, 48 years after the fields of Pressburg were fertilized with German blood, that a German king finally defeated the Magyars in a decisive open battle. His name was Otto, son of that same Duke Otto of Saxony who had won the skirmish at the Unstrut River in 906, the victory that had inspired the fatal campaign. Otto the Great crushed the Magyar army at the Battle of Lechfeld. It was a total, brilliant victory, and it ended the Magyar raids for good. That victory made Otto a legend, the savior of Christendom. 3 years later, he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, founding a new empire that would last 1,000 years. But that resurrection, that new dawn for Germany, came at a cost that is often airbrushed from the triumphant narratives. Before Lechfeld, there was Pressburg. Before the empire was reborn, it had to die. And 100,000 men paid the price in blood and oblivion. So what, in the final analysis, was the Battle of Pressburg? Tactically, it was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare, the complete victory of mobility, firepower, and strategic deception over mass, armor, and linear thinking. The Magyars refused to fight the battle the Germans wanted to fight. They turned the Germans' greatest strengths into fatal liabilities. A huge army requires huge supplies, moves slowly, and is difficult to control. Heavy cavalry is devastating in a charge, but useless if it cannot catch its foe. The Magyar strategy of lure, delay, encirclement, and harassment was executed with flawless patience and discipline. Strategically, Pressburg was a geopolitical earthquake. It destroyed the last remnants of Carolingian authority in Germany, creating a vacuum that would eventually be filled by the Ottonian dynasty. It secured Magyar dominance over the Carpathian Basin for generations, allowing them to transition from a predatory confederation into the Kingdom of Hungary. It rearranged the power dynamics of Central Europe for a century. But beyond tactics and strategy, Pressburg is a profound human tragedy and a timeless lesson in the pathologies of decision-making. The failure was not primarily military. It was psychological, political, and cognitive. Luitpold and his fellow leaders were victims of what we might now call groupthink, confirmation bias, and sunk cost fallacy. They launched the campaign not because a cold analysis suggested it would succeed, but because a volatile mix of wounded pride, political pressure, religious fervor, and wishful thinking made it feel necessary and inevitable. They interpreted the absence of the enemy as fear, not as strategy. They dismissed warnings from men like Count Dietmar because those warnings contradicted the narrative of inevitable victory they had all invested in. They continued the siege of Breslau-Spurk long after it had served any purpose because to stop would be to admit error. They chose at every critical juncture the path that preserved their honor and political standing in the short term over the path that might have saved their army. Pressburg teaches us that the most dangerous mistakes are often made not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet rooms where wars are planned, where ego dresses itself in the robes of strategy, and where the fear of looking weak outweighs the fear of failure. It is a story about the catastrophic cost of leaders who cannot adapt, who cannot understand an enemy that operates outside their cultural and tactical frame of reference, and who are so committed to a course of action that they march, eyes open, into a trap of their own devising. The field near modern Bratislava is quiet now. The bones have long since turned to dust, ploughed under by centuries of farmers. There is no grand monument, but the echo of that disaster, the lesson written in the blood of 100,000 men, still resonates. It is a reminder that power is fragile, that assumptions are lethal, and that history's most enduring lessons are often written not by the victors, but by the vanquished, in the silent language of obliterated armies and forgotten graves.